Some participants are still filtering in, but I'll go ahead and just welcome everybody into today's keynote address. And thank you for coming to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference and joining us today for the keynote address from Yumna Kamil and Stephanie Hayter, the co-founders and executive directors of Refuge, a legal think tank devoted to finding legal solutions for climate migrants. My name is Claire Money, and I'm a PILC co-director. I'll be introducing our speakers and moderating the Q&A session following the keynote address. Before we get started, I have just a few announcements, and then we'll go ahead with the keynote address. First of all, a bit of a tech warning. Don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all the attendees are automatically muted with videos off, so you'll only be able to see the speakers. And throughout the presentation, if you have a question, please use the Q&A to ask it. Stephanie and Yumna will give their presentation, and then there will be time for a Q&A session at the end where they can answer your questions. Please remember to be courteous of all viewpoints throughout the presentation and the Q&A session. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience wanting to earn CLE credit for attending this event, as well as others throughout the conference, in just a moment, I'll share a link to register for CLE credits. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, helps to provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you're interested in making a donation to FLAW to help provide students with those stipends, information to do so will also be shared in a Google document in just a moment. Lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at the University of Oregon and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. PILC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. I know our keynote speakers today are joining us internationally, and our audience is attending from all over. So I encourage everyone to research and acknowledge the history of the land they're currently on. And I will now introduce our wonderful keynote speakers, Yumna Kamil and Stephanie Hayter. Yumna Kamil is a Penn LLM Public Interest Fellow and works in human rights in London. Called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2020, she is passionate about and has experience in asylum, immigration, public interest, and anti-human trafficking law. Yumna is a qualified mediator and has strong interest in empowering those whose rights have been undermined and engaging the help of a wider community by initiating dialogue between the two. Stephanie Hayter is a Penn LLM graduate with experience in drafting government reports for both the Australian and German Parliament. She also holds a Juris Doctor from the University of Hong Kong. Stephanie is devoting her legal career to the protection and conservation of our natural environment. On this basis, she will explore the legal impacts of climate change and its threatening effects on our survival capacity. And I will now hand it over to our speakers. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. I'm currently in Hong Kong. It's very early in the morning, but let's do this. So I'm Steph, co-founder and executive director of Refuge.
And I'm Yumna, and I'm also a co-founder and executive director of Refuge. And I echo Steph, thank you so much for having us. We know that the theme of this year's conference is a different normal. And so in light of that, we'll be discussing three things. Firstly, the issue of climate migration generally, so what it entails and who it affects. Secondly, the current normal when it comes to the approach to climate migration. So what policies have attempted to address it so far and the shortcomings of the existing legal landscape. And thirdly, the different normal that we're pursuing. So where our work fits into it all. And in advance, I'd like to thank members of our Refuge team, specifically Robert Loss, Dr. Rafiqul Islam, Shambhavi Kant, James Sedlak, Emma Cooper, Aubrey Calloway, Vaughan Raja, Rachel Aronoff, and Mia Bazar, as well as Ola Terway, because we will be referring to their research and contributions throughout this speech. And I will hand off to Steph to introduce the issue of climate migration.
Thanks, Yumna. Okay, so the way that we define climate migrants at Earth Refuge might look a little different than other organizations do. So I'll explain why we have chosen to call climate migrants, and what that actually means to us at the organization. So climate migrants are migrants that are led by push factors rather than pull factors caused by climate change. So push factors are conditions in migrants' homes, countries that make it difficult or even impossible to live there. While pull factors, you can imagine, are circumstances in the destination country that make it more attractive, for example, to live in that home country. So what we're doing here is talking about push factors. So more or less, it's about forced migration. So even though the word migrant itself doesn't reflect that sense of urgency, it's still important to note that there is one. So some of these climate push factors are, I think we're all aware, heat waves and droughts. You've got wildfires, you have floods. Sorry, you might be able to hear my cat in the background every now and again. Got heat waves and drought, wildfires, floods, and of course, sea level rise. And then there is a further classification, which I think everyone in the climate sphere probably is aware of, is the slow onset and the rapid onset distinction. So you've got your slow onset, your gradual changes, obviously, again, sea level rise, increasing temperatures, land and forest degradation, and so on and so forth, and your rapid and sudden onset ones, so hurricanes, storms, flooding, and we hope to cover all of those at Earth Refuge, because they obviously need very different solutions. There's another really important point I want to make, and that is causation. So it's really, really important not to muddle up or group together regular weather events and climate-induced disasters. So although they're both disasters, as lawyers, we know how important distinctions are when it comes to definitions. So obviously the difference is difficult to distinguish, but one is only a climate migrant if the extreme weather event which caused an individual to move was a result of climate change. So we need to establish the causation between the climate and the event, which of course can be very difficult, even with the help of science. So when it comes to, let's say, hurricanes and typhoons, or even wildfires, when are they not your ordinary hurricane? That's already been happening for thousands and thousands of years. When are they a climate-induced hurricane? So it's really, really important to make that distinction at the outset. So we fit the definition of a climate migrant. There was, in fact, a whaling case in Japan, very rare, where the judge did permit evidence to be submitted to show that an X event was induced by climate stresses. So yeah, they set that distinction or clarified the definition from the outset. Say it properly. Then so following on from all of that, what is it not? So obviously volcano eruptions, or when it comes to pollution just on its own, pollution can count sometimes if it's, for example, exacerbated by climate change, but otherwise not really. And I say not really lightly because it's a very gray line. And then you also have your more unexpected climate stresses. So there are, for example, cold spells. Even I was surprised when I read about this, that, there's rising temperatures. Why should cold spells count? But there is science that Arctic warming is actually linked to colder winters, which is fascinating. So ultimately, let's get back to the climate migrants. All of these climate stresses obviously put pressure on people to leave their homes and livelihoods behind. So for decades, we've been aware that this is happening. You know, we speak about droughts, we speak about floods, but we often don't actually speak about what happens next. You know, we speak about the crisis, but what actually happens to the people impacted by the crisis? Obviously, the impacts vary immensely and human responses differ, and the effects are multifaceted due to the varying nature of the disaster itself. So just like I talked about the slow onset versus rapid onset, for example, you know, do you have to make a quick decision or do you actually have time to calculate your next move? Then what position are you in? Do you have access to relief, for example? Because we do have to note that climate change impacts have a lot less destabilizing effects in developed societies than they do in developing societies. Then also you have to ask yourself the question whether leaving is an option or whether staying is an option. Sometimes cultural ties to the land, for example, mean that impacted communities will find it really, really difficult to leave. So all in all, climate migration should only be the last resort. And I think that's a really important point to make here. And that brings us back to the push factor as well. It is forced migration. It's not really a choice. So despite it being the last resort, the numbers are absolutely shocking. They also inspired Yumna and us to really start Earth Refuge. So I've picked out a few for you guys today, because usually, I mean, numbers help me in grasping the scale of the issue. But don't forget that, you know, each of these numbers do represent a real human experience. So I hope you guys are ready, because so on average, you have 26 million people that are displaced by disasters such as floods and storms every year. So 26 million people, that's one person forced to flee every second. That's a lot. Another stat I have here is the number of those forcibly displaced due to climate disasters has continued to climb from 82.4 million at the end of 2020 to more than 84 million by June 2021. This also includes conflicts and violence as well, but so that's according to the UN Refugee Agency. Sorry, let me turn my emails off. And then there are predictions, which are even more shocking. And this is probably the prediction that is the reason why Yumna and I are here today. So according to the Institute for Economics and Peace, a think tank that produces annual terrorism and peace indexes, predicts that with the world's population forecast to rise to nearly 10 billion by 2050, as many as 1.2 billion people living in vulnerable areas of the globe may be forced to migrate by 2050, which is not that far away. It's actually quite close. So that's, for example, almost the whole population of India. I'll leave you guys to Yumna now to speak about the most affected populations and also where this is happening.
I'm unmuted. Thanks, Steph. So when we discuss who is most affected by climate-induced displacement, by proxy, we also speak about where they are. It's important to note that climate factors that cause displacement are affecting the global south, and that's slightly sort of better documented, but it's also impacting communities in the global north, as we increase with wild in Oregon. The common denominator in worldwide trends, however, is the fact that those hit first and worst are typically communities that are marginalized due to poverty, discrimination, or a combination of both. We will be touching on demographics throughout this talk, but I'll begin with a common thread, and that is the fact that worldwide, women are disproportionately affected by climate displacement and rendered more vulnerable to trafficking as a result of it. For instance, in 2018, CEDAW, so the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, released a recommendation that was centered upon the gendered dimensions of risk reduction in the context of climate change. And this was the first time that a UN body addressed the connection between climate change and human rights, but also focused on the gendered impact. And this recommendation established that state parties can and should be held accountable for the negative impact climate change has upon women and girls. So when we speak about the vulnerability of women as a result of climate change, that is determined by social, cultural, and economic factors. What I mean by that is, firstly, women and girls constitute a huge portion of the global population that's living in poverty. And that translates into a high dependence on natural resources for their livelihoods. So for instance, fetching water, farming, rearing animals, and also harvesting crops. In rural areas where women are solely responsible for fetching water and collecting wood and so on, women sort of wake up early and walk to fetch the wood and literally keep their communities alive. And recently, Al Jazeera did a really thorough report on Angolan refugees in Namibia who had fled for this very reason. And a large proportion of those who had fled were women who were carrying the burdens of their families. The second factor that drives the vulnerability of women is a global lack of education. So this bars the adaptive capacities of displaced women and girls, both before, during, and after the journey. Because women are often denied the right to an education, that means they are forbidden from practicing in policymaking and from decision-making roles. And that means that they're less likely to receive important information that enables emergency responses in the face of disasters. And that further limits their right to adapt once they are displaced, because they don't have that buffer of initial information. The vulnerability of women that exists because of this lack of standing in a global society also increases their vulnerability because they are often forced to stay in a place where resources are scarce because of climate factors. So they haven't received fair warning. They have a lack of education to adapt in a new location, and so they have to stay where they were. And this leads to women being forced to travel long distances in search of basic necessities like food and water and support. And this exposes them to the risk of sexual harassment, the risk of violence, and even assault during their journey. If women are able to migrate, there is an increased risk of gender-based violence, and that's a matter of concern. For instance, in refugee camps, that isolation and vulnerability is increased. And a study conducted by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature found climate change to actually be a catalyst for gender-based violence against women. So the susceptibility to violence paired with the lack of resources means that gender-based violence is also used as a measure for reinforcing control over the resources that remain. So if there's a fight for resources in a larger population, it's been reported that in Eastern and Southern Africa, and particularly in Kenya, for instance, fishermen have refused to sell fish to women who do not agree to engage in sexual favors. And this practice is so well known that it has a name. It's called the Jaboya system. And following on from that, there's now a new generation of child brides and child trafficking because families are no longer in a position to provide for their children or to educate them or to feed them. And in an attempt to relieve this problem, they often marry or perhaps sell their daughters off at a young age. And that clearly impacts the physical, mental, and sexual well-being of a child and is a violation of children's rights by proxy, and by proxy, women's rights. all of these factors stemming from climate displacement have exacerbated the issue of human trafficking. And women and girls are often trafficked as a result of climate factors for sexual exploitation and forced labor, especially in the textile industry. And so what we have is this vicious cycle where climate change exacerbates the trafficking of women, which increases the unpaid workforce in fast fashion, which increases the amount of fast fashion products that are produced, which then adversely affects the environment. And so it's this awful, awful cycle. In terms of where this is happening, as I said, it's happening globally, but when we look at certain locations and zoom into them, we can notice certain trends. So in Bangladesh, various communities are affected by climate displacement, but a specific example would be the existing refugee population. And by that, I mean the Rohingya peoples who have already fled from Myanmar into Bangladesh, into refugee camps, specifically Cox's Bazar. And then due to environmental risks, which are exacerbated by overcrowding within those camps, the government sought to find an alternative and a way to mitigate those climate factors that were affecting a huge number of people. And so the government funded the Asharian 3 project. This was the commission of the sort of revamping of an island in Chittagong, which is in the Bay of Bengal. And the idea was to simulate a city, if you will. So living quarters, sanitation, food, warehouses, so on and so forth, and to transpose this refugee community into this island. Studies were carried out by a research group, and one of our advisors was involved in this study, and it was deemed appropriate for temporary resettlement of Rohingya refugees. Compared to other refugee settlements across Bangladesh, it was more feasible. And this was especially true when compared to the fact that many natives of Bangladesh are also living on islands that are affected by climate factors. Measures on these islands were implemented to mitigate cyclone risks and other climate risks. But a year and a half on, it's important to note that Bangladesh is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. And so 19,000 Rohingya refugees have been on Bhasan Char, on this island, since the May of 2020. And it has culminated into the effective warehousing of them. So they are basically trapped on this island. They cannot leave. If they try to leave, they are faced with negative repercussions and even violence. And life has become very limited. And so existing refugees are faced with further uncertainty and are left in this legal limbo. And climate change is the backdrop against which this is occurring. So when we think of trying to address climate displacement, when something is deemed a temporary solution, it's really important not to lose sight of that fact and to sort of assume that by initiating a temporary solution, we've washed our hands of it. And it hasn't solved the issue at the center of Earth Refuge, which is the lack of legal protections for those facing climate displacement. Another theme that we see running through where climate displacement is happening is the impacts of climate change on indigenous communities. So if you contemplate the Torres Strait Island, which is part of Australia or under the protection of the Australian government, this island was brought to our attention by Professor Martin Scheinen, who was the first UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism. And he brought to our attention the case of Billy et al. Versus Australia, which is set to be heard before the UN Human Rights Commission. And it was brought by, or it is being brought by, an indigenous community on the Torres Strait Island. So according to press releases, this case is about the threat to indigenous culture and the ability to live on home islands. So it is really suitable that Claire mentioned. Indigenous ties to land and our comprehension of it and our appreciation and respect for that and what that means. So the prominence of culture in this case is actually reflected in many jurisdictions. And the idea is that culture is by definition intergenerational. And for some communities, that means more than it does for others. And when you think of culture and you think of it as a legal right, there is the right to transmit a culture, so to pass it on, and there's also the right to receive it from your elders. And many Indigenous communities have a focus on ties to land. So for instance, the Torres Strait Islanders are feeling tangible impacts of climate change due to rising sea levels because the graves of their ancestors are being washed away by the tide. And animals that are tied to specific spiritual practices are dying off and sort of drawing closer to extinction. And so the crux of this claim is that the Australian government has failed to protect this community against climate factors, and as a result is contributing to their cultural erasure. Culture is wide in scope. It's really difficult to pin it down to one central definition, but it includes traditional or typical means of livelihood, which are often collective, and that also relates to language. If a community's livelihood is tied to land, then it translates into language that is used and passed on to future generations. And when the core of that community itself is being wiped out, we risk wiping the people off the face of the earth. And so prevention is essential, but preservation also is. And once this line of argument has been established, the idea is that when it produces a result, it can then be carried over. This right can be carried over from Indigenous communities into wider communities on a global scale. And the final region that I just wanted to zoom into, which is of more relevance perhaps to most of our audience members, is the effect of climate displacement in the US, and specifically where there are predominantly Black communities. So if we look at somewhere like Flint in Michigan or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there is a rising phenomena of involuntary stayers. And that is when a community is specifically affected or adversely affected by climate factors and actually needs to move, but due to systemic discrimination and barriers, they don't have the ability to move. And the roots of this are in redlining, which is an element of urban planning, a discriminatory practice in which services are withheld from certain communities who reside in neighborhoods that are classified as dirty, so that the wider population associates that community with being dirty because they happen to be situated, for instance, next to chemical plants or dumps and further away from green areas like parks and fresh food sources. And these residents in the US largely belong to racial and ethnic minorities. So societally, that leads to an association with dirtiness. And it leaves these communities further exposed to climate events because of a lack of infrastructure, because of a lack of access to healthcare, and a lack of security and adaptation measures. So although they need to move, they typically don't have the means to do so. And there are very few government policies that would shoulder that burden for them and enable that route out. A study published very recently by Nature Climate Change, which was conducted by US and UK researchers, found that although floods are affecting impoverished white communities in the US Northeast right now, in the coming decades, that risk will shift to Texas, the Gulf Coast, and the Southeast, where there is a higher number of Black communities. And overall, the authors estimated that there would be a 40% increase in flood risk in places where at least 1/5 of the population is Black. And so I feel like that portrayal speaks for itself about who is affected, where they're affected, and quite frankly, why is a pretty man-made reason. So I will pass it back over to Steph to discuss the shortcomings of existing immigration frameworks when it comes to climate displacement.
Oh, I love listening to Yumna speak. Okay, so there have certainly been attempts to introduce law and policy, but that's what they seem they are, just attempts. Despite, as I discussed before, the numbers are shocking and they're considerably higher than refugees fleeing from war and persecution. There are no really existing legal frameworks that do protect climate migrants. So I just want to list a couple of attempts there have been. So Biden, his long anticipated report on the impacts of climate change on migration, for example, was quite disappointing, I'm sorry to say. But while many organizations, including ourselves, we did obviously praise the fact that the document does exist and it does contribute to awareness in general, but it failed to include actual policy prescriptions and pathways on how we can move forward. Secondly, there's also been talk about expanding temporary protected status, so TPS, for a few years already. But currently, TPS only prevents deportation back to a few designated countries where huge disasters are affecting the country as a whole. So you've got the hurricane in Honduras, for example, or the earthquake in Haiti. But there is room for improvement. So if we were to actually expand it, it could prevent the deportation of climate displaced people back to any disaster zone. So including disasters that are localized, really, rather than looking at countries as a whole. But there is one attempt, which is the Kiribati case. That's probably more than just an attempt. And people working in this sphere are all aware of this case. Because the outcome, despite the claimant having lost, is a pivotal stepping stone in the right direction in the legal sphere, which is why I'm going to actually take some time on this case. So for you working in this sphere, I'm sorry you have to listen to this again. But yeah, this case is about a individual from Kiribati, which is an independent island nation in the Central Pacific Ocean. Our lead correspondent, Ole, he actually spent some time in Kiribati a few years ago, and he wrote an archive piece about the people of Kiribati and the impacts of climate change on their livelihoods. So do feel free to head to our archive and have a read. And during his time there, he spoke to a man named Akineti, who I want to quote here. So he said, "When I lost my home to the sea, my 2 sons and I fled to Tarawa, that's the capital of Kiribati, to find a job and better protection from the threats of climate change. However, I then returned only 1 year later as the situation in Tarawa was even worse than in Tabiteta." So it's happening everywhere and it's happening very fast. What's more devastating is that it is going to get a lot worse. So according to calculations by the World Bank, about two-thirds of the atolls will have sunk into the sea by the end of the century. So inevitably, this is one of the places on the globe where measures must be taken now. So just a little bit of a background with regard to the case itself. So the claimant is a national of Kiribati. His name is Ione Teitota. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I hope so. And for several years in the 2000s, him and his wife, they struggled with living in poor quality land, frequently affected by high tides and flooding. So finally, in 2007, they decided to leave their home and move to New Zealand. But eventually, him and his family, they reached a dead end as far as their legal status was concerned. So this is where it gets interesting. They then engaged with a brilliant activist lawyer, Michael Kidd, who decided to frame their claim under a new concept. of a climate refugee. So this is quite groundbreaking. And eventually they lodged an asylum claim under the Immigration Act and the Refugee Convention. Ultimately, at the end, the UN did reject his claim, which is devastating. They made the argument that he wasn't in immediate danger, but very important, the wording of its ruling might potentially, let me put it that way, allow others to claim asylum based on climate change. So sending asylum seekers home when their lives are threatened by the climate crisis, in their words, may expose individuals to a violation of their rights. Specifically, it mentioned their right to life. So Amnesty International did call this a global precedent where a state will be in breach of its human rights obligations if it returns someone to a country due to the climate crisis, where their life is at risk, or there's a danger of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment triggered. So despite the UN having rejected this claim, this is very much a landmark decision in this sphere. And there is some hope that we can use this in the future for social impact litigation. Speaking about wording and the importance of it, especially in the legal sphere, I do want to go back to why we use the word climate migrant. And I will link this together rather than with the word climate refugee at Earth Refuge, because, well, we are legal professionals and we tend to overthink the meaning of each word. But also we want to include all migrants in our analysis when we are looking for crafting solutions for climate migrants, including those that are internally displaced. So legally speaking, the definition of a refugee is someone who crosses the border, as defined under the Refugee Convention. And there's definitely arguments, that the word refugee adds a sense of urgency to the crisis. So people might be more inclined to listen to what we have to say, but legally speaking, it just isn't the best term to use because it only describes a small portion of those fleeing climate disasters, even though the numbers are big. And that's what it is. It's just a description. So it doesn't really have that legal potency that we want. Whereas the word climate migrant does include everyone. There's also another reason, and I want to return to Kiribati here. In Kiribati, there is this concept of migrating with dignity. So many in Kiribati actually don't want to be coined as refugees because it victimizes them. And rather they have asked the international community or they've told the international community that they want to migrate with dignity. So it's a policy and it's part of Kiribati's long-term nationwide relocation strategy. So there's different parts of the policy, but basically the first part is to create opportunities for those who wish to migrate abroad. And then they will match those opportunities with those that are available in places elsewhere. So this was actually one of the reasons that also drove us to use the word climate migrant. But that's not to say that climate migrants cannot find protection under the Refugee Convention. They can, it's difficult, but they can. So I want to mention one example here. In France, a man from Bangladesh, he was granted asylum, but under the Refugee Convention, as a climate refugee, but health factors did also play a role. So climate here wasn't enough. The French Appeals Court made this decision by taking into account environmental conditions in the applicant's country of origin, so in Bangladesh. And the court then effectively declared that the environment meant it was unsafe to send this man back due to his asthma. So even though there were other factors involved and it was very difficult to establish this case, and even more so difficult to really coin him as a climate refugee, the case can still ultimately serve as a legal precedent for future climate-induced displacement cases.
So I will do a quick run through of existing legislation that references or could incorporate the protection of climate migrants. But an important caveat is the fact that neither of these has, to my knowledge, been implemented widely. So in the EU, only 2 member states, namely Sweden and Italy, have immigration regulations that explicitly address the issue of climate migration, but they are what I would dub as dormant. So in Italy, people can be eligible for protection under Article 20 of the Immigration Act. And they are people who are defined as unable to return to their country of origin due to a contingent situation and exceptional circumstances that do not allow for safe conditions upon their return. And so it is being argued that environmental reasons are included within that definition. But if an application has to be made, that's not an automatic right. And if that application is successful, resident status is valid only on Italian territory, so it doesn't expand into the further EU. And it is not as beneficial as full-on refugee status under the convention. So there's reduced access to social welfare, and there's no family reunification principle. But this does incorporate, or there is an allowance for access to the labor market within Italy itself and mainstream health services. But since this definition's introduction in 2018, the tool has only been used once as a means of protection. In Sweden, the situation is slightly less bleak. So there is a need for protection that requires a triggering environmental event. And the protections are slightly more cohesive and comprehensive than the Italian legislation. So there is international protection, there's healthcare, there's social welfare. But when the so-called refugee crisis occurred in Europe in 2015, this protection was suspended while the Swedish government focused on the crisis at hand. And the protection was meant to be suspended until 2021. And to my knowledge, it has not been reactivated since then or used for anyone's benefit or protection. So what these 2 pieces of legislation show is that this has been discussed by policymakers as far back as the 1990s, but it's not being used, it's not being refined, and quite frankly, it's not something that we can refer to as we engage in this work, or at least not yet. In terms of previous initiatives that could be re-implemented in the sort of climate migration legal landscape as a means of protection, there is the Nansen Initiative. So this was introduced in 1922, following the Soviet government's decision to revoke the citizenship of almost 1 million Russian citizens living in exile. So this was a largely Jewish population, and they were scattered throughout Europe. So in response to this crisis, the then High Commissioner for Refugees decided to issue a certificate, which was basically a means of citizenship and protection. So ratifying states were obliged to issue passports to stateless Russian civilians so that cross-border movement would be allowed and integration into society would be allowed. And 2 of the most famous recipients of that certificate were Aristotle Onassis and my favorite pianist and composer, Sergei Rachmaninoff. This was discontinued. The Nansen Initiative was discontinued in 19 in the 1930s, the late 1930s. In the early 1940s. And its revival has been discussed by the German Advisory Council on Global Climate Change. It could perhaps work, and the parameters could perhaps ensue that, the polluter pays principle could be enforced. So countries that are producing the most emissions or the highest level of emissions would be responsible for taking in communities that are impacted by their activities if there is a scientific causal link. But I think that an initiative like this is unlikely to work because it's only been in discussion. It hasn't even reached the policy making level. There have been no formal steps in this direction. And if the results of COP26 are anything to go by, then the landscape for prescribing or assigning accountability is still bleak. There are some existing systems in place that seek to address the issue of climate migration. So again, within the policy sphere, less legal. The European Parliament and European Commission began to discuss the climate migration as early as the 1990s, and links to poverty and its exacerbating effects were identified very early on. And various studies and reports were brought forward, and Green members of Parliament in the European Parliament sort of petitioned to discuss the issue more. But this discourse came to a halt in 2015, as I mentioned, with the so-called refugee crisis, where attention was diverted elsewhere, especially by media influence. So this discussion and its trajectory has not really been significantly visited since then. It wasn't even discussed at the COP26 to sort of a basic extent. The Paris Agreement of 2015 officially acknowledged migration as one of the consequences of and responses to climate change, but no significant action has been taken since that acknowledgement was made. And the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants also acknowledges the impacts of migration as a result of environmental and climate change factors, and it refers to both dimensions. But again, no significant action has been taken, although it's been pointed out. The IOM, so it has been working on and considering the impact of environmental factors on migration since the 90s as well. And that led to the Global Compact on Migration, which is significant, but again, it's a policy measure, not a legal protection. It aids states, so the Global Compact on Migration aids states with initiatives that they take and provides information and observations through studies. But what it does not do is produce binding regulations or legal liabilities or mechanisms for accountability. So while it's a resource, it doesn't provide recourse. The Sustainable Development Goals could actually be used to bolster the status of those being faced with climate displacement or who are facing the risk of it inevitably. Eva Mach has outlined that the Sustainable Development Goals could provide a springboard for governments to address migration, environment, and climate change. For instance, by evoking Goal 1, which is to end poverty by building resilience of vulnerable populations. And what that could translate into would be, for instance, adaptive farming policies and ensuring that women are at the helm of that education so that it can be passed down to future generations. And what that could look like in real time is enabling largely rural farming communities to adapt to extreme weather events, be they slow or rapid onset. And that would sort of render migration a last resort, as Steph mentioned at the very beginning of our talk. It would mean that migration wouldn't be the go-to, and communities could build independence, resilience, and stability. Goal number 2, also food security and sustainable agriculture, feed into that narrative of empowerment of affected communities, as opposed to requiring them to just be picked up and dropped off elsewhere. And disaster risk reduction also plays a huge role. And there are significant initiatives in the US being carried out to follow through on that goal. But again, this international initiative feeds into policy as opposed to legal accountability or rights or duties. And when we do think of accountability, as I said, the COP26 summit, which happened at the end of last year, showed us that accountability is tweaked and reduced in the interests of diplomacy until initial targets are lowered. We didn't reach the coal production or lowering of coal production goals that we thought we would going into COP26. What all of this points to is how taxing it would be to create an all-encompassing international convention that would have a uniform definition of what it means to be a climate migrant. If you think of how long it would take to draft that convention, and then to encourage states to sign that convention, and then to integrate that legislation into national legislation, it's not feasible when met with the sheer number of people who are fleeing climate factors and the widespread effect it's having on a global scale. However, it's not all bleak. We at Earth Refuge are pursuing solutions from a different, more community as opposed to state focused angle. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Yumna. Yeah, so finally, we're getting to the part where we speak about Earth Refuge and what we do at Earth Refuge in light of everything that we have just discussed. So as Yumna just said, we want to go local, especially because we want solutions now. And what our ultimate goal is to address the legal gaps by crafting legal solutions, local legal solutions. And most importantly, we want to consult communities and individuals throughout the entire process. So it's very much led by them. We want to make sure that the solutions we come up with are the solutions that they are asking for, because we aren't experiencing what they are experiencing. So that very much lays at the foundation of what we do. And then at last, we want to merge the testimonies of communities and individuals with our legal insights to come up with legal solutions. And we do so by analyzing existing frameworks. So as Yumna just mentioned, coming up with something entirely new can take a very, very long time. It's also possible that nobody will listen. But if we're looking at what's already out there, I think there might be a chance for legal recourse. And what we're doing is basically reading legal recourse into judgments that have no mention of them, of climate migrants, and we're hoping to use creative legal minds to reinterpret these judgments and to hopefully find a way to protect climate migrants. And then also, once we come up with these solutions, provide communities and lawyers with those resources through our website. And then also, of course, while we're doing all of this, we're hoping to bring this whole conversation about climate migration into normal discourse. So we want to talk about it all the time, which is also why we're here today. So there are 3 legal projects that help us achieve this mission. And we also have a community that bolsters all of that work as well. But the 3 core legal projects at Earth Refuge are legal research, legal advocacy, and legal education. I'll leave Yumna to talk about legal research and legal advocacy. And then as she's heading both of those at the moment, and then I will dive into what legal education means.
So legal research is our central project, and it serves as the foundation for our other 2 legal initiatives. And it consists of 2 sub-projects. Firstly, our legal database, and secondly, our toolkits. So as Steph mentioned, our goal is to read protections into existing cases or conventions or soft law. And what that means is taking a creative approach, very much outside of the box, to understanding what arguments have worked, where there is a similar factual matrix to the issue that a specific community is facing, and which arguments did not work and how they can be improved upon. So for instance, the whaling case that Steph referred to earlier, it's called Whaling in the Antarctic, Australia versus Japan. And it was brought before the International Court of Justice. And although whaling is not directly related to the movement of people, the key point that we drew from the obiter discussion of the judges is the fact that it spoke to the potential of the submission of scientific evidence to prove the causal link between climate change and the events in question, namely the drivers of migration. And in turn, what that means is that there is the potential to implement transnational accountability. So to prescribe a certain level of accountability, perhaps not 100% of it, but a certain level of it to one country where we can prove that its corporate activities or engagement in fossil fuel activity actually led to the destruction and then displacement of a certain community in another jurisdiction. So all of these cases that our brilliant legal researchers have struggled to find are then analyzed through a climate migration lens. They're then summarized and published on our legal database, which we launched in December of 2020. So the purpose of that database is to serve as a resource for lawyers, law students, or even non-legally minded people to understand that a creative approach is possible and a number of rights are in existence already. And this can then be used for social impact litigation, for a dissertation, or simply for campaigning for the rights of affected communities. The database serves as the foundation for our largest and slowest burning project, which is our legal toolkits. The idea behind this is sort of enshrining access to justice. Many communities that are affected by climate factors and are driven to consider displacement are not aware that they could be regarded as climate migrants. And that also means that they're not aware of their potential rights and who they can be implemented against. And when we think of that, it could be local authorities, national governments, institutions, or even companies. So the purpose of the toolkits is to collect all of the relevant soft law and case law, as well as a significant level of field research about what is happening in a certain area and what the trends are and what the predictions are, and to sort of amalgamate it all into an accessible and simplified toolkit so that affected communities can understand the landscape that they're facing and whether or not claims can be made. So crucially, this will not be legal advice, but rather a resource and an educational resource as well. But it will also serve as a practice guide for lawyers in those jurisdictions, because what Steph and I have found since launching Earth Refuge is that there's no shortage of lawyers who want to represent these communities, but rather there's a lack of a comprehensive body of law for them to even start building a case. And so we hope to further that cause and to encourage lawyers to bring impact litigation. And also this will serve as the basis of our future social impact litigation. And that's a pretty good leeway into my discussion of our legal advocacy project. So our legal advocacy is three-pronged. Firstly, we hope to raise awareness through panels such as this, or keynote discussions rather, such as this, because, as I said, there's no one comprehensive sort of source that lawyers can consult and understand the legal landscape of climate migration. So it's important to raise awareness and sort of drive motivation for representation of these communities. And secondly, networking plays a huge role. So we are slowly but surely building a network of legal professionals who are on the ground in certain places, from Brazil to Southeast Asia, to the UK, Europe, South America, the US, you name it. hopefully we will eventually cover the globe. And the point is to tap into their intel and to approach the legal issue of climate migration with a level of humility. So not to approach the issue and just, think we have a level of authority because we have a legal background, but rather to understand the nuances of a certain issue and to bring a claim alongside local lawyers. And our current projects include legal research for active cases. So there are a number of lawyers who have immigration cases or environmental cases where climate migration is feeding into the factual background, but they're unsure of how to tie it to the Refugee Convention or the Convention Against Torture or various land rights. And so our task is to conduct that legal research to bolster the claim in favor of climate displacement and to show that that is a right that is being violated, and also to legitimize it. So hopefully the cases will succeed, but if they don't, at least our foot is in the door and we are bringing this issue to the attention of judges who are perhaps hostile because it's novel. So our most recent case, and obviously I'm limited in what I can share, but what I can say is that it was a case centered around a native of Guatemala, from an indigenous community in Guatemala that has faced environmental discrimination at the hand of the government as a result of environmental policymaking. And the results of that policy led to the mass displacement of an indigenous community. It led to violence against protesters, and it led to drought and starvation and the barring of livelihood, because this community, its culture was so closely tied to fishing and farming, and that has been cut off, and no reparations have been provided by the government, for instance, in the form of education or financial reparations. And so there's been mass migration across a border by this indigenous community. And so the legal challenge is fitting it within the definition of a refugee and showing environmental policymaking as a form of persecution. And now Steph can discuss our legal education project.
Thanks, Yumna. I'll run through it very quickly. So the goal of our legal education project is basically to educate the next generation of lawyers on the topic of climate migration. And we're hoping to, again, bring the topic of climate migration into normal discourse at universities. And we also hope to encourage a collaborative and creative approach to problem solving in this sphere. So as I mentioned, we work with universities across the globe. So the US, for example, Canada, and Hong Kong as well. And what we do is we give lectures, we host panel discussions on climate migration, and then we build, partnerships with institutions as well. And we also enable students to contribute to Earth Refuge through pro bono projects. IRAP, for example, and encourage them to interact on every level, everything that we do at Earth Refuge. So whether it is legal research or contributing to our archive phases, which I will talk about in a bit. But one project that is certainly worth mentioning, it was completed by students from the University of Hong Kong. So they conducted field research in a small fishing village in Hong Kong called Tai O. I've been there as well. It's a beautiful little town, but it's definitely facing the effects of climate change. And Hong Kong is in generally seeing more and more frequent and severe extreme weather events. And typhoons in the city are forecast to follow the global trend of increased severity. If you guys have time, you can Google Tai O, but all the houses are just on wooden stilts, so they are very fragile. And then, you've got, adding to the whole mix, you've got rising sea levels as well, which is obviously another product of climate change. So in the low-lying area of Tai O, the residents are mainly made up of the elderly, and they have really borne the brunt of these extreme weather events. And the typhoons, for example, have brought in floods that damage homes and belongings as well. So they conducted a field report which examines the existing policies meant to protect Tai O residents, and they tried to see whether these are adequate. So they conducted interviews with local residents, community leaders, and NGOs in the area. We are going to publish this brilliant report very soon. It even comes with a video where they had drone footage and whatnot. So it's very exciting, very informative. Well, exciting might not be the right word, but the way that they have edited it, but very informative information. So it should be coming out on our website very soon. And actually towards the end of this report, they also briefly provide suggestions of improvement to the government. And so hopefully somebody will have access to this and listen to what is being said. And then, as promised, I am going to talk about our archive and our faces as well, which is part of our larger Earth Refuge community. So even though our aim, as we've been talking about this whole time, is to provide legal solutions to climate migration, the law does not operate in a vacuum. So providing context through insight into surrounding issues and perspectives is absolutely crucial. And we want to dispel the myth of lawyers as the gatekeepers of justice, and want to bring this gargantuan issue into normal discourse. So that's also the purpose of Archive and Faces. It contextualizes everything that we do at Earth Refuge. And it allows Yumna and I to learn about this issue. So when archivists submit a piece on, let's say, the public health crisis in Malawi, Yumna and I will learn more about it, and we can craft our solutions according to the research that archivists have come up with. So Faces, you can visit our website, go to the Faces tab. It puts a face to the statistics and it amplifies the narratives. So it's what I was talking about at the beginning. It's at the core of Earth Refuge's consulting impacted communities. So that's what our Faces prong is really for. So we have got some interviews, just to name a few, all of them are brilliant, with, for example, John and Martha, a family living in California, and they share their experience with wildfire and the drying climate. We also, one of our correspondents, Aubrey Calloway, conducted an interview via WhatsApp, so anything is possible, with a Cambodian tour guide about extreme weather in his area and in Siem Reap. And then also we have one brilliant interview with Native climate justice organizer Ruth Miller, which I recommend you guys listen to, where she discusses her work towards an indigenized just transition amidst the urgent threats to her people and the land. And back to our archive again. So it does provide context for the wider audience, and it's a platform for people who are interested in sharing or investigating the issue of climate migration further. So there we have pieces again, like the public health crisis in Malawi. And I mention it again because when I read it, I had no idea about what was happening. And then we have pieces about, how Southeast Asian climate activists can tackle climate displacement, pieces on corporate accountability. This piece was written by Vaughan. So anything you can imagine that is related to climate migration, you can find in our archive. And if you cannot find it, feel free to write a piece and send it to us so we can get it up there. Yeah, I'll let Yumna talk about her next part.
I'll just very briefly add to that. We have one last community element, and that is the Current Affairs Initiative. So when we launched Earth Refuge just over a year ago, I set up my Google alerts to climate migration, climate displacement, and a few sort of synonyms. And for the first 3 months, all I received were articles centered around monarch butterfly migration as opposed to human migration. And it wasn't until the Biden administration's executive order on climate migration that news articles started to surface more frequently and more informatively about climate displacement, where it was happening and how it was happening. But what we found is that the way in which they were written was quite jargon-y and just not very clear, especially for a lay audience. And so we decided to recruit current affairs reporters. And so their task is to look through headlines that relate to climate displacement or its drivers or its solutions, and to condense them and relay them in an accessible manner. So all of our current affairs pieces are typically no more than 3 or 4 paragraphs, and they aim to carry through common threads of news and keep us updated, but keep our readers updated as well in an accessible manner. And that is what we do at Earth Refuge. I'm conscious of the time and the fact that there are a few questions in the Q&A tab. Please feel free to ask any more. But to wrap up, what I will say is that although the landscape is fairly bleak, apologies, it's midnight here in London. Although the landscape is bleak, our pursuit at Earth Refuge is of a legal and tangible impact that is community-based and that encompasses humility. We don't want to speak over the voices of affected communities. We seek to amplify them. They know best, and they should be the ones to shape their solutions. We're also well aware of the fact that this is a huge issue. It's likely the largest crisis of our era, or the largest sort of impact of the climate crisis. And so we don't think that we can solve it all, but our aim is to go small, apply customized solutions, and hopefully set precedents as we go. And this approach doesn't seek to undercut the current normal. And in fact, we'd be open to work with or alongside it. But our approach is always going to be focused on support and the nuances of the experience of climate displacement for communities in different locations and with different needs. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that you found this informative and that hopefully you will support our cause and get involved.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'll go ahead and ask you the questions in the Q&A. We have a couple queued up, but as Yamna said, please feel free to ask any questions. We have about 15 minutes left to answer them. So first question we have is, what mechanism could be used to prove a country's responsible for climate change or negative social impacts? Who would then decide that this proof was or was not enough to then be used to enforce a judgment against them?
I can give this a go. I hope that we answered this in the body of the talk, but I think the most obvious answer would be looking to the science. And I don't think it will ever be clear cut, but often, especially when experiences are particularly poignant with events that are slower onset, scientific evidence can be used to prove that causal link between corporate activity and its impacts in a different jurisdiction or within the same jurisdiction. There is that ancient case of the acid rain case, where communities in Canada were affected by US activity. Apologies, I've forgotten the name, but I can send it through afterwards, where it was established that corporate activity in the US was affecting communities and health in Canada. And it was sort of done in the early 1900s. And so it's possible, even though it's challenging, and we need to look to the scientific community for support. And then in terms of who would then decide that this proof was or was not then enough, it would depend on local courts. And I think once local courts start making allowances, it will be inevitable that higher up courts and international courts will also give face to this issue. And I really do think that at this stage, it's a matter of setting a precedent. No matter how impactful or not impactful it is, it's important to get this on the agenda of judges and to introduce this as sort of a common thread of litigation in coming years. So I don't have a straight answer, but I do think that the science is probably the best bet we have.
Thank you. Our next question is, can you talk about the relationship between climate migrants and climate damages litigation? So lawsuits seeking compensation from fossil fuel companies for their contribution to climate change, for instance. This person is thinking of the fact that one of the first such climate lawsuits was Kivalana v. ExxonMobil, which was ultimately unsuccessful, in which the plaintiffs were seeking the cost of relocation. And also that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples guarantees a right to reparations if an Indigenous community is displaced from their lands.
Steph, did you want to, or shall I? Okay. There aren't really many cases that can speak to the direct relationship between climate migrants and climate damages litigation as of yet. I would point you to the Royal Dutch Shell case, but given your knowledge of this sort of more niche case, I'm sure you're aware of it already. But that case does set a precedent for, limiting corporate activity and implementing accountability. And I think it can be transposed to a climate migration situation. And I think the next step would be sort of asking for further compensation, not just limiting activity. And the point about Indigenous communities and reparations, and the link between climate migrants and climate damages, I think I can't directly answer your question, but I would also point you to the concept of intergenerational justice, which we are increasingly seeing in the courts. So right now, the Duarte Agostinho case is active, where a number of Portuguese miners sued multiple governments for lack of protection against the climate crisis. And I'm hopeful about the final result. But regardless of whether or not it's successful, it's setting a huge precedent. And similarly, in Australia, last year, it was decided that the Australian government had a duty to younger generations or youth to protect them from the climate crisis. And so what we are increasingly seeing is government accountability, legal accountability for climate change, but also the requirement to protect certain populations within society from its impacts. And so I think the next step would be reparations to Indigenous communities or communities that are highly impacted that don't have an alternative, and who the government or various governments could feasibly have protected from things getting this bad. So I apologize that I didn't directly answer your question, but I hope I've given you a few resources that you could look to, and perhaps, you can marry those together and see a solution there.
Thank you. I think right now that's all the questions we had in the Q&A. I have a question for you. Yamna, when we spoke a while ago, preparing for you guys to give a keynote address, you mentioned that just the gap that you saw in what you guys are doing, and that so far most of the collaboration you've had has been more in the immigration and asylum law sphere. So I guess I was just wondering, a big part of our audience is probably more in environmental law, and what kind of gap do you see that folks on the environmental law side can close, and what would that look like?
It's a really good question. And our collaborations remain largely immigration focused. And I'm not sure if that's because the climate migration matrix is rearing its head sort of more obviously within immigration cases, or if it's because our network is largely comprised of immigration lawyers, but I don't think that that's the case. There's definitely a gap that can be closed by environmental lawyers. And there definitely needs to be collaboration, not just with environmental lawyers, but also with environmental NGOs. And I know that the NRDC is taking certain steps to try and fill that gap, but we definitely welcome it, and we definitely welcome that sort of collaboration. And it largely would relate to land rights, but also the types of impact that we're seeing. What activity is exacerbating the factors? Where is that happening and why? And what are the effects on populations? So I think it's important to note that we're not just looking at populations that have already moved or are starting to move, but also populations that are most at risk of moving, because either it's inevitable and protections have to quickly be drafted for them, or it's inevitable but slightly less urgent and protections can be drafted to prevent the need for movement, or at least sort of buffer for less traumatic movement. Because what we often see is that climate or environmental factors are occurring and a community desperately has to leave. And there is that sort of dragging of the heels for leaving, which is entirely natural, because why would you want to leave your home and everything you know? But then what's happening is that these communities are being dispersed. So you don't just have one entire community that's being transposed to another location. And that leads to further instability, the breaking of community ties, so on and so forth. And so I think if environmental lawyers could help us to preempt those environmental factors, that would be incredible. And I think it's definitely something that we hope for on the horizon.
Thank you. Our next question is, are there countries at this time that look more likely to assist climate migrants? You mentioned Australia. Are there others? Which countries seem most opposed?
I can answer this question. I actually think the following question is very much linked to the one that you just read out. So maybe I can answer them both in one go. Did you want me to read it out, Claire? The second one as well, or did you want to?
Yeah, go for it. Thanks.
Okay, so we have another question that's asking, what are your thoughts on legal efforts to institute a right to a healthy environment as part of the public trust to be held for younger generations, and how those young people may then try to receive damages for the destruction of their resources? So I think I can answer both of these questions in one go, because there are certainly countries that are more likely to assist climate migrants. I'm not exactly sure which countries are explicitly opposed to it, but I can definitely speak to the ones that are encouraging litigation in this area. So obviously, the US is one of those. So even with the Biden report coming out, there's definitely more conversation about this issue more generally. And that means that it's very likely that courts, or that there will be litigation in this area more frequently as a result of that. But more specifically, there are cases in India, for example, on the right to a healthier environment, as well as the right to life and how that can link to climate migration. So it's not explicitly talked about in these cases, but there is definitely room, and there are discussions on this case on how they can be useful when it comes to climate litigation. And they very much, in India, for example, have the right to a healthy environment enshrined within their constitution and their laws more generally. So I think in these kind of countries, it's a lot easier to initiate litigation, because once you establish the right to a healthy environment, the next step would then just be to bring in climate, because migration is an inevitable result if the places that you live in become uninhabitable, right? There's also a case in the Philippines. Actually, there are a few cases in the Philippines on this issue as well. So also on the right to a healthy environment, as well as intergenerational justice that Yumna just talked about. So I think the case, it's Opasa case, where they speak about where they actually granted standing to future generations which is incredible. It's definitely a landmark decision, and I think a lot of countries in the world should learn from that decision and adopt similar reasoning as well. So I do encourage you to actually read the judgments. Yeah, it's poetic. I think it's a good way to put it. So the right to a healthier environment was established for future generations. So yeah, there's certainly countries doing more than others, but I'm not sure, Yumna, if you know of any countries that are directly opposed to it, though.
No. I think what they're more likely to be opposed to is accepting that they're accountable, which probably feeds into the question that was just asked.
Thank you.
I think it's feasible that, sorry, I should read out the question. The question is whether we think that countries who are knowingly contributing to climate change and creating climate refugees without helping to accommodate and help these refugees could be held accountable in an international court for human rights offenses for knowingly destabilizing current climates and causing huge amounts of human suffering. I don't think it's unimaginable to bring a claim against a country for climate impacts. I just think it's unlikely to happen in the current climate. I think so many of us had high hopes for the COP26, and I keep referring back to it. And although nothing legally binding was going to come out of it, it was a huge purpose of the COP26 was to give us a snapshot of how international communities and authorities were willing to respond to this issue. And it was shockingly lesser than we expected. And what that shows us is that it's still an old boys club, and it's highly unlikely, other countries have to consent to bringing a nation before an international court and prescribing accountability. So I don't think it's impossible. I think existing legal tools would allow for it. But I think it would be diplomacy that limits the possibility of that happening, but I'll never say never.
Great, thank you guys so much. That's the end of the questions we have for you, and we're right about at time. So I think this is a good place to say goodbye, and thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you, Yumna and Stephanie, for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye, take care.
Bye.